Hi, my name's Al Beck. I'm the Director of Psychology and Psychotherapy for SLAM, and I'd like to welcome you to these broadcasts, which are looking at the health and social care inequalities that we need to address if we're going to build psychological resilience in our communities. Today we are going to focus on the patient and carer race equality framework, and we're very lucky to have Dr. Laddie Smith here to talk to us about that and the work that's being done in SLAM and further afield in our local communities and with our local communities about that. So you'll know that this broadcast series is very much a community perspective, and we hope that we have lots of audience members from both our local community and further afield. We'd like you to take full advantage of the Q&A function and post questions that you have for Laddie or about the PCREF in the function, or to answer the questions that other people post and begin a discussion or a debate. Perhaps you'd even like to set up meetings and further discussions about this topic in the chat function, and we'd be really pleased to hear those and see those. So with no further ado, I'll just turn to Laddie and ask you, can you just introduce yourself for those people who don't know you?
So my name is Dr. Laddie Smith. You might see my name written as Shubbu Laddie. Everyone calls me Laddie for short. And I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I work at the South London Maudsley as clinical director for forensic services. I also happen to have another role, which is as a presidential lead for race and equality at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And I share that role with Dr. Raj Mohan. And the aim of that role is really to try and improve access, outcomes and experiences in mental health for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and also to improve equality issues generally for people with protected characteristics. And very importantly and relevantly for this broadcast, I was involved in developing the patient and carer race equality framework, which is a recommendation that arose from the Independent Mental Health Act review that was carried out a couple of years ago, the findings of which came out at the end of 2018. So I think we're going to be talking about the PCREF today.
So can you tell us a little bit about the background? Why do we need a PCREF?
So it's been known for many years now that there are major disparities in access, experience and outcomes for people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds when it comes to mental health. And that's across the board, actually. So in terms of people who developing mental health problems and accessing mental health services, and then in terms of how people are treated or feel that they're treated in mental health services, we know that, for example, if you are from Black, African or Caribbean background, then you're up to 4 times more likely to get sectioned than if you're from a white British background. When people are in hospital, they're much more likely that if you're from a BAME background, actually just to say, it's not just Black people, it's Asian people as well, and anyone from any minority background, or also someone who's even a recent migrant, much more likely to get sectioned than someone who's white British background. If you are in hospital, particularly if you're from a Black background, you are much more likely to be in the locked area part of the hospital or the more secure area of the hospital, and it's disproportionate. The numbers are disproportionate compared to the numbers of people in the general population. And when it comes to actual treatments, there are concerns that if you're Black, you're much more likely to be given higher doses of medication, more likely to be restrained, forcibly injected, more likely to be secluded. And of concern is that when you do come into hospital, you're more likely to be brought in in crisis. And there's much more likely to be police involvement or criminal justice involvement. And when you are, and when you look at treatment, particularly psychological treatment, if you're white, just to say across the board, it's hard for everyone to access psychological treatment. About 13 to 14% of white British people are able to access psychological treatment. That goes right down to 6% of Black people and Asian people. So there's something about being from an ethnic minority background, which means that not only do you find it's hard to access mental health services, but when you do, you don't really get offered all the treatments, in particular psychological treatment, and that's a big concern.
So yes, absolutely. So cutting to the chase, Laddie, you're a hugely experienced psychiatrist. You've been in the system for a long time. You're also a Black woman with a huge reputation. What do you think? What do you think are some of the issues that we need to tackle? Why is that?
Oh, that's a big one. So, so there was often said, you know, for years and years and years, it was said, well, it's simply that psychiatry is institutionally racist. It's not as simple as that, actually, because we know for sure that a lot of people have problems long before they come anywhere near mental health services. The problem starts earlier. That's not to say that there isn't a problem in psychiatry, but what the problem in psychiatry just mirrors the problems everywhere else. And so essentially, you know, we live in a situation that means that certain groups, if you're from a certain minority group, particularly if you're a visible minority, then you are much more likely to be socially disadvantaged. And the kind of social disadvantage is a kind of social disadvantage that increases the risk of developing mental health problems anyway. So, for example, we know that unemployment, poor housing, crowded housing, poor educational opportunities are associated with an increased risk of developing, of having health problems generally, full stop. This is just any health problem, including mental health problems. We also know that having adverse childhood experiences increases the likelihood of a person developing mental health problems as an adult. And I think that's particularly important because adverse people, it's interesting, people think of we talk about trauma a lot, and people think about childhood trauma and what that might involve. And that childhood trauma, you know, we know that people who are physically or sexually abused it's often by their family members, but physically sexually abused have an increased risk. And we also know that emotional abuse, emotional trauma is particularly important. And of course, if you're physically and sexually abused, you are necessarily emotionally abused. What I think has been overlooked for many years is that actually there is a form of emotional trauma that impacts on people who are from minority backgrounds. And that is the impact of everyday, sometimes casual, sometimes not even seen at all, not in any way overt or covert because it's institutional or systemic. The impact of that discrimination, that racism, affects people's emotional states. It's a form of emotional trauma. And people, you will have heard increasingly now in the last few weeks and months about racial trauma. This is something that was talked about by a guy, this is a psychologist, Black psychologist in America called Robert Parker, was one of the first people to talk about it. There's a few people, psychologists, talked about it. And the impact of what it is growing up in a society where you are viewed negatively often just because of the colour of your skin. And even though you may, you know, live your life not really having experienced over racism, there are some basic things that exclude you from having access to just having access to things that everybody else has access to, and it's taken for granted and it's not picked up. So I always talk about, you know, the tights test. If I go into Sainsbury's around the corner and try to get some tights, then the options available will be nude, tan, black, nearly black, maybe, or blue. But what's interesting is that nude colour and tan colour are essentially tights for white people. If I want to get nude, my nude is not the colour of the tights that are there, but across the board, the way you go, generally, tights nude is a colour that is a kind of, if you like, a kind of pinkish brown colour, but it's definitely not for black people. It's really for white people. And so what that means is that I'm excluded from just in very basic everyday things. It might seem a trite thing, but actually it's not, because when I need tights, it's really annoying. But, you know, I'm excluded from being able to access the world of tights. Now, there are many things from that very fairly trite thing right up to much bigger things that mean that if you are from an ethnic minority background, you are necessarily excluded from a lot of opportunities. And that takes its toll. In addition to that, if you're from certain ethnic minority backgrounds, particularly if you're Black, you are constantly bombarded with really negative images and negative stereotypes. And for some people, that really is quite traumatic. And that's before you even get to the more overt racism that people have to experience, for example, being followed around the shop or being stopped in the street by the police because you're a young Black man, for example.
So these are profound issues that you're talking about, Laddie, and they are insidious. They're part of the fabric of the way that we are operating at the moment. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the PCREF that you and others have proposed here, and help me understand, because this is obviously a national development, and there are obligations under the Equality Act for us to act responsibly as organisations, not just, this isn't just a SLAM specific phenomena. So can you tell us how it's similar or different from others?
So I think that what you just said there is really important. There's something about the fabric of the way in which we live that lends itself to people of colour experiencing trauma on a pretty regular basis. And what happens is that you are brought up to try and deal with that as best you can, but of course there are temperamental aspects about how you might deal with that. There are stuff to do with some of the other social disadvantages, etc., that I mentioned already. The PCREF, Patient and Care Race Equality Framework, it's a framework for how an organisation can start to slightly shift some of those structures, the fabric of how we live, the fabric of our organisation, how you can slightly shift some of the structures in such that you can reduce the inequalities in the access experience and the outcomes. And what it actually is a process. So everyone knows that there are problems. Everyone knows what the problems are. And what frequently happens is people say, do you know what needs to happen? What needs to happen is you need to make sure you've got more Black people on your board. What would help is if you had more Black staff. What would help is if you had more Black psychologists. The difficulty is what people don't talk about is how you actually get there. So the PCREF is not the what so much, but rather the how to do this. Now I need to tell you that my network is not brilliant, so I might just drop out, but I'll try and come back in again. If you can't hear me, just let me know. But essentially it is a way of supporting organisations to learn how to meet the needs of their local population, and necessarily to do that, rather often what happens is organisations say, yeah, we're going to develop a service here and we're going to invite you to come to our service. The problem with that is that if the service is developed by a group of people who actually have very different experiences to the people that they're offering the service to, then things might be missed. And there might be misunderstandings about what the needs of that population are. The very first thing that needs to happen is that you need to go and talk with the population. And in our case at SLAM, it'd be our local population. You first of all find out who they are, because lots of assumptions are made. I mean, one of the classic things that happens, this happens in research, this happens in everything, is that everybody is lumped together. So, for example, South Asian people are lumped together as though everyone's the same, that Indian people have the same experiences as Bangladeshi people and so on. But in fact, these are really different groups of people who have different experiences of how they might have migrated to the country, for example. So as South Asian people of Indian origin, migration in the 70s was very much around encouraging people who were already doctors to come to Britain to work as doctors. Bangladeshi immigration in the 80s and 90s was primarily around people fleeing war and basically being refugees. So it's a really different population with different needs. And that's not taken into account. So that heterogeneity that exists within minority groups is just put to one side. And so if you have an organisation that views everybody out there as the same, then the problem with that is, of course, you're not necessarily going to develop a service that takes into account the needs of that population. So the first thing you do is, number one, find out who your population is. Second thing you have to do is go and talk with the population and find out what they think the issues are. And then, sorry.
No, please carry on. Yeah.
I'm hoping that it's still working.
And we'll let you know if it doesn't. You're okay. Fine.
And then what you need to do is you talk with that population, and it's really important that the ideas about what's needed are generated from that population. And that's not going to happen until you make, as an organisation, we have to make ourselves accessible, and we need to be good neighbours. You know, we're part of the community, but we need to be good neighbours, and we need to do whatever is needed to make people feel comfortable about talking to us. All too often, you'll hear the term, "Oh, they're hard to engage," as though the problem lies with the local community. The problem doesn't lie with the local community. The problem lies with us making sure that we are suitably accessible, so people feel comfortable about coming and talking with us. That's no mean feat, I think, given some of the history of SLAM's engagement with the local community, but that can change. Then what you do is, once you have established really, hopefully, good and meaningful connections with your local population. I'm happy to say that SLAM have already been doing this. Zoe Reid and Jackie Dyer have done a lot of work around developing partnerships with the local community. Jackie Dyer being a local community leader. Zoe Reid has done huge amounts of work over the past few years and spent a lot of time and energy developing a really robust partnership working arrangement. And what happens then is that people in the local community feel more empowered and able to speak up and say what they think their issues are and what they want to do to try to start making what they think might help to make a difference. And that doesn't mean to say that it's going to work straight away. So but what you would do is that you will sit down in the local population, you work out what you think might help, and then you have say you give yourself a 5-year program. At the end of the first year, you say, well, where would we like to be at the end of the first year? And you determine what you think you should happen. So it might be that we would like to see 10% improvement in the percentage of people who are being sectioned from a Black background, or we would like to see a 25% improvement in satisfaction ratings from the BME population compared to what it is now. And that's something that will be decided with the local community. And what you do is that you think, okay, how do we get to that point? And what we have suggested is that you use quality improvement techniques. And there are you can use a quality improvement approach, and you have little projects that, again, the local community help determine what those projects should be. And then you work to those projects, and there's lots. Actually, I mean, this is what I think. Often people think that because it's a complex problem, you have to find some new way of doing it. It's not that. It's about actually doing bits, doing it in a small way, having a project that is doable and realistic, and working to that, and doing it in an iterative way, meaning that you have your project, it's either a quality improvement project, or you evaluate your service, and then you see, you audit, you see where you are, having instituted the intervention that the local community has suggested. Has it worked? If it hasn't worked, then you alter it and you modify it, and then you try it again, and you do it in that way, so that hopefully by the end of the first year you've moved forward. By the end of the second year you've moved forward again, and so on, until by the end of the fifth year, hopefully you've been in a pretty good place, such that you've ironed out some of those structural inequalities that disadvantage.
So I've got a question here from one of the audience. Will Nicholson would like to know, what are the groups, who are the external partners that you're working with? You've said it's, obviously it's a very diverse group of people, and, how it would be good to know how we can really kind of, get onto those true fabric type questions. How do we know that we're reaching and hearing all the challenges that there are, and whose expertise are we drawing on, and which local community partners are we currently working with?
Good question, very good question. So What Zoe's done, Zoe and Jackie. So Jackie Dyer is a local Lambeth councillor, and she is chair of a Black Thrive, which is a local charity. What they've done is that so Slam serves 4 boroughs, and in each of those boroughs they've linked in with so there are various people from local charity. There's local charity in Croydon, for example. There's Croydon BME network, for example. There's local charities in Southwark, in Lambeth, and in Lewisham. Also, there are local community leaders. So, for example, as I say, like, for example, councillors like Jackie. There's people who are involved in parenting and fostering, local social workers who don't work at SLAM. There's a variety of people, actually. In this particular partnership group, it's primarily people from the Black community, and also from local churches as well. There's additional work that's been done by Louisa Codjo, who's done, she's a psychologist at SLAM, and she has done a lot of work linking in with local churches. So there's also input from local church leaders as well. So it's a variety of people. I have to say that there's always room for more voices and different voices. I would say in particular, it would be good to see some younger people involved, actually. When I've been to the partnership groups, I'd say it's mainly older people. So
it'd be nice to have some suggestions, perhaps from the audience, about groups to link with and how to do that. We've also had a question around, what the PCREF will mean for people on the ground, staff on the ground in SLAM, people on the ground in local communities, people in either working for charities or community organisations or volunteering for them. What will it mean on the ground?
So for people in the local community, it's kind of the easiest thing, which is that it will mean that somewhere that I think probably usually feels like this rather closed off institution will and should become much more familiar to you. So, for example, when I'll be at the Maudsley, which is across the road from King's College Hospital, and sometimes you walk, less so now, obviously, but in the pre-COVID days, you walk through the car park and there'll be someone looking around and they'll say, "Excuse me, can you tell where the cardiology department is?" And you say, "Actually, you're in the wrong hospital. King's across the road," because people think it's still part of King's. Now, I find it very interesting that the Maudsley is actually one of the world's most famous hospitals, full stop. King's, however, is famous only really within Britain. But if you ask anyone in Lambeth or what's your local hospital, they'll say, "Oh, King's." They don't think of the Maudsley at all. It's not thought of as being a familiar community asset. What I hope will happen, and gradually over time, is that the local community will begin to see the Maudsley as a familiar local asset, somewhere that becomes like a local neighbour that they can rely on and trust. And I think that you can see in the partnership group that people now feel comfortable about at least coming into the building, and I know for sure that some years ago people wouldn't have even felt that comfortable about coming into the building, never mind actually sitting and influencing what happens within the institution. For staff, it will mean doing things a bit differently, and depending on the kind of how you run your practice, if you like, the kind of staff member you are and how you work with people, it will be easier for some and less easy for others, because what it's going to mean is that the approach will be much more of a joint approach, a partnership approach to working with people. And it will mean that it's not going to be about you having an idea and then checking if people are okay with it. It really will be about other people telling you how they want things to be and you having to adapt to that. So I think it's going to require a bit of a culture change for staff. For local community charities and community workers, we are saying actually part of this is probably going to require a bit of a change in commissioning arrangements. So it might mean more resources and more. It might not be monetary resources, but it might be physical resources to support local charities, to support the local community better.
So tell us a little bit about the differences between this PCREF and other PCREFs across the country? Are they all the same? Do they take different approaches? How will they learn from each other?
Well, the PCREF is a process, and every single community. So, for example, the big mistake is when people think, because it's a competency framework, you develop competences that are suitable for your local area and your local population. The big mistake is if people think, oh, well, what there is a national competence framework. That's been done. You know, there's a Wales competence framework for race equality already. You know, that's when people say, you know, if you're a competent organisation in terms of race equality, you will make sure you've got, you know, this percentage of BME people on your board. You'll make sure that you have this percentage of BME people in senior positions in your trust, blah, blah, blah. That's all very well, but it doesn't tell you how to get there, as I said at the beginning. So it's a mistake to think that you can have national competences. What you can have is a national guidance on how to develop your PCREF, how to develop a PCREF, what the actual steps are in the process. Necessarily, if you are doing it properly, each area, their PCREF is going to look different because each area has a different local population. So, for example, the worst thing would be is if you had the idea of a national competence framework for race equality, and because you're in Cornwall and Devon, you think, well, we haven't really got that many, you know, less than 1% of our population is from an ethnic minority background, so we don't have to worry about that. That doesn't apply to us. That's not the case. What should happen is that everybody should be able to go out. So if you're in Cornwall or Devon, you would go out, you'd find out who is our local population. And although you might not have a significant proportion of visible minority people, you may well have a proportion of people from you know, who were, say, farm workers from Eastern European background who are cut off from a whole heap of services, who are having difficulties. So your focus would be on that group of people, and your you know, your competences would be focused around how do we help this group of people so that if they should need us, they know how to access us, and they have as good an experience as everybody else. So each PCREF necessarily has to be local. The national work is about helping organisations to understand the process and what the process involves.
That's brilliant, thank you. I've got a bit of a challenging question here, Laddie, which is, you know, you've given a very clear steer that this is all about listening. This is about listening to Black and minority ethnic people, listening to their diverse views, listening to our local communities, and changing as a result of what we hear. But there's a question here which says it takes years to build trust and relationships with diverse communities. What about the impact that years and years of not feeling included, of being discriminated against? What about the toll that takes on trust, and how are we going to overcome that? What do we need? Do we need a new model? Is it more than listening?
So this isn't just about listening. This isn't just about listening. It's listening, and it's listening in a different way, and it's also acting on that listening. It's doing something different, because usually what happens is people say, oh, we've got to have a focus group, or we've got to have an inquiry. You have an inquiry, and the inquiry comes up with recommendations. So one of the things we've been doing recently is collating all the recommendations. There are hundreds, and then the recommendations are put out there in a report, and then nothing happens. So this is, instead of, we've got enough recommendations, people have done some listening, but what hasn't happened is the doing. So it's not just the listening, it's the doing. The fact is that the questioner is correct. This has been years and years and years and years of being undermined, undervalued, and of course that engenders a real lack of trust. There is no quick fix to it, I'm afraid. It's going to take time. In its very essence, getting to be a PCREF competent organisation is probably going to take about 5 years anyway, and even then what you'll be in is a position whereby people will feel more some people will feel more comfortable about using the services and having a better experience, But then it's going to be, I think it will be generations before we properly equalise out the system. My hope is it won't be generations. I mean, I wouldn't have thought I would have seen a black president in my lifetime, but that happened. So it might not be generations, it might only be one generation. That's going to be partly dependent on everyone's willingness to do this. And we are going to have to take, to a certain extent, a leap of faith that, OK, I'm going to have a go and I'm going to get involved. And that's one of the biggest things I say to you. Please, please, please get involved in this. Please come along and give us a chance. And, you know, there'll be various ways of you know, supporting and putting your voice out there. And there'll be, you know, people aren't going to get it right straight away. You know, what's the best way to engage? It might be inviting you to a focus group or a survey. It might be a party. We don't know yet, but we're going to need people to tell us how they want to engage. And no, it's not going to be a quick fix. But it is not just listening. The difference now is it's listening and then doing and checking and also measuring what's being done. And if it hasn't worked, then changing the intervention.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting, Lade. And so thank you to you, Dr. Lade Smith, and thank you to the audience for a rich and interesting discussion. And any questions that haven't been answered, we'll try to get back to and answer by email if you've left your email address. If you haven't left your email address, do it now. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday for the next broadcast. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.